Good afternoon. Your program guide says that Will Schneider is the moderator, but instead I, Jo Atkinson, am sitting in because Will is going to be our first presenter. I think most of you know Will. Some of you call him Bill. He's retired emeritus professor who created the oral history program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And he's been president of the Alaska Historical Society, and while president, started this project to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Different folks expressed interest in the society making a contribution to the scholarship and understanding this significant piece of legislation that was going to have its 50th anniversary. And under his leadership as project director, he compiled a great committee. He raised money. He worked with the university so that the program would not only be on the AHS website, but also on ScholarWorks. And then oversaw contracts with researchers and edited all of the different pieces that people were writing and putting together. So we have the Historical Society owes a great debt of thanks to Will for his undertaking this project and leading it through. And he's going to pursue a couple other projects from what was discovered in the course of putting together this guide to sources, over 1,000 pages of wonderful research material. Also presenting after Will be Sue Sherif. Sue is a retired librarian from the state of Alaska, and the committee could not have found a better person to work on sources and checking information than her. Well, she was with the state of Alaska. She was in charge of the Alaska Native Libraries program, providing libraries around the state with materials, holding workshops, and promoting library uses of resources and sources. So this talented team of two is going to introduce you to the Society's guide, which has recently been finalized and put up on ScholarWorks. Not joining us today was the wonderful editor for the program, Karen Brewster, who also was an integral member of this team. And so when Sue presents, I think she has some of the materials that Karen produced for the presentation. So as we did this morning, since I am in the Atwood building, Judy Bittner's office, I will be moving over so that Will can take this seat and make his presentation. Welcome to the session.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to start off by noting that 3 or 4 years ago at a small coffee shop in Fairbanks, the idea for this project was really Jo Atkinson's. And so she needled us into thinking about it, and Karen was an integral part of this and an integral part of making it happen. I can't imagine a better team. And Sue and Jo produced one of the volumes in this project, the one with that is the bibliography. And so it's a marvelous team effort. The ANCSA guide idea was to look at what was available in the way of primary sources and secondary sources, oral histories, videos, news articles, the variety of material that could be brought to bear to an understanding of ANCSA and what it means. And so that was the original vision, and a team carried that out, and we're really happy that they did that. The presentation today starts with my giving a brief overview of what ANCSA is, and I apologize to those of you that were in the morning session who will have heard some of this same material. But if we could move to the next slide, I'll begin to talk about it. So what is ANCSA? December 18th, 1971, President Nixon signed Public Law 92-203. This granted 44 million acres and close to $1 billion to Alaska Native corporations. It was hailed by the Nixon administration as a major shift in policy from termination to self-determination. So moving to the next slide. It established regional corporations, native regional corporations throughout Alaska. And as you can see, some of them are very, very large and some are much smaller. And this raised issues in terms of resource distribution and economic distribution of revenue after land claims. But the formulas that were developed for land claims are tried to accommodate this in very creative ways. And maybe we can say more about that later. Next, please. So why was ANCSA necessary? The history of native land claims goes way back to the coming of settlers to Alaska and the impingement on native land and resources. And Aboriginal claims were recognized legally by the government, but were often ignored by the public. Part of the policy at the time was one of assimilation, that is to make Native people like settlers in all aspects of their life. The federal government tried to force natives into their settlement mold. Next, please. So the rights of Alaska Natives were established or recognized very, very early on by the recognition of Native rights in general in the United States by Chief Justice John Marshall, who ruled in 1831 that Natives are to be treated as sovereign nations, but the federal government must function as an overlord with responsibilities for their welfare. This has been described as wardship. So we have both the recognition of rights of sovereignty, and we have the recognition of the federal government having a responsibility to Alaska Natives, which is the federal trust responsibility. Next. The Alaska State Constitution and the Statehood Act were important steps in rallying the Native community to action to support their land claims. In the state constitution is the common use provisions that I talked about this morning, which basically said that the state could not discriminate between users or user groups within the state when it came to the management of natural resources. The other major issue was in the Statehood Act, where in the Alaska Statehood Act, there was a provision, Section 6, which enabled the state to make selections of land, and then Section 4, which said that the state was not to select any land that might be subject to native claim. Next. So the new state began to select land. Eisenhower signed the statehood bill in 1959, and very quickly, the state needed to develop its resources. It needed to pay its bills and build a meaningful, needed economy. The actions, however, impinged on native land or potentially impinged on native land. Next, please. Two big issues that developed. One was Project Chariot, the plan to detonate an atomic explosion at Cape Thompson in the northwest of Alaska. This was an Edward Teller big bomb project. It was, it never took place, thank goodness, but in the process of developing this plan, the Native community rallied to fight against it and garnered the support of the National American Indian movement in helping them fight against this. And this was a galvanizing event for the Native community as a whole. Next, please. Then the other major plan was to create the Rampart Dam. This was one of Greening's favorite projects. It would have created that whole area encompassed in blue that you see there from basically Chalkitsik upriver on the Yukon down below Rampart on the Yukon, a huge area in order to create hydropower. And it would have flooded the subsistence area in there, as well as impacting subsistence resources, of course, but also impacting fish and wildlife that lived in that area. Next, please. Those two developments created national interest in doing something about land claims. Native groups throughout the state began to organize. Fairbanks Native Association, Cook Inlet Native Association, and most prominently, the Arctic Slope Native Association in response to oil exploration activities on the North Slope, as we'll see in the next slide. Two prominent leaders, Joe Upikson and Charlie Edwardson Jr. Charlie Edwardson was a major leader in rallying against the leasing operations and making a claim for all of the land on the North Slope. He rallied the Arctic Slope Native Association to enlist William Paul, the famous Tlingit lawyer, to write a letter to the governor and others, stating equivocally that that land belonged to the Native people, all that land, that they were low in population, but that they depended upon that huge area of resources for their livelihood. And this is one of the critical issues that would later influence land claims as to how do you deal with low population areas but incredibly rich resource areas versus areas that maybe have a huge population and little resource. How would a land claims bill evolve to accommodate that? Next, please. So one other local effort was the Tanana Chiefs Conference. Al Ketzler was very instrumental in organizing the villages on the Yukon River and the Tanana River to come together to form an association to voice their concerns and claims. And as you'll see in the next slide, they worked to accomplish this in several meetings. What you actually won't see it in this slide. I was anticipating that, hoping that I had another slide in there. But anyway, two other big developments. Secretary of the Interior in 1966 created a land freeze which said that the state was not to select land until land claims was settled. The other thing was the discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay in 1968 and the ensuing lease sale. Next. So, whoa, can we back up one? And then go ahead one, please. So the act itself created a corporate solution. Money goes to regional and village corporations. There's a settlement with natives both before December 18th, 1971, and later amended to accommodate those born after 1971 if the corporation decides, its stockholders decide that they will accept those that were born after 1971 as stockholders. These were commonly called the afterborns, which has created issues in some of the corporations. There is a revenue sharing provision in the ANCSA Act, which is called the 70-30 split. That is, that 70% of the revenue that a corporation gets from use of its natural resource extraction must be split amongst the other regional corporations. They, in turn, must provide a share to the village corporations in their region. The regional corporation that has the profit of 30% then can use that to generate further revenue of their own. The Act itself abolished Aboriginal title and Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights. This was a major blow to many Alaska Natives who wanted control of their hunting and fishing rights on their land, so that the land that was granted, the 44 million acres, was seen as private land subject to fish and game regulations, just like any other private landowner. The notion of federal interest lands, the 17T2 lands, were proposed for study. And so 9 years later, I think the next slide, we have ANILCA, which is the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. That act created Title VIII, which did provide a rural subsistence preference on federal land. It also provided major wildlife refuges and parks throughout the state. So what we're left with is this question of, was ANCSA an act of termination or an act of self-determination? And I think it's a bit of both. From an economic standpoint, there's no question that the corporations are a powerhouse. From a Western legal and economic framework, they had huge impacts on the sovereignty of particular in areas of subsistence, so that there is a decrease in the sovereignty of Alaska Natives with the abolishment of Aboriginal title and Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights. Has ANCSA diminished the federal trust responsibility? Those of you that were in the session this morning probably would answer that by saying yes and no. In some areas, the federal government has made efforts to if not restore, accommodate certain forms of sovereignty. But the ultimate answer to sovereignty must come from Congress. Congress is the only body that can determine really the fate in terms of Alaska Native cultural groups when it comes to their legal standing. Next slide, please. So now we're on the guides to sources. So Sue, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. Hi, I am Sue. I'm speaking to you from Fairbanks, and I am on sort of intermittent bandwidth. So I apologize, or I guess I should warn, because I have no control over it, but I should warn you that there's a possibility that I will be on and off. But right now, so far, so good. So the guide that this project, inspired by the 50th anniversary of ANCSA, as Will said, is formally called the Guide to Sources for the Study of the 1971 Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Quite a mouthful. And it has 3 volumes. We're going to concentrate in this session on the first 2 volumes. Volume 3, Resources for Teaching ANCSA at 50 by Michael Hoffield, I believe is going to be touched on in the next session that's actually focused on teaching ANCSA. So volume 1 has several parts. It's a daunting in length. It's 1,055 pages, and it starts with an introduction to the guide by Dr. Schneider, Karen Brewster, and Joe Antonson, and a descriptive essay with the history of ANCSA in a little more detail is the first part. The second part is actually it's not in the order listed here. It's the timeline by Joe Antonson that runs from the Treaty of Cession in 1867 and runs through 2021 with the Supreme Court's ruling in Yellen versus Confederated Tribes of Chehalis that recognizes Alaska Native corporations as tribes for the purposes of federal funding, even though they are not considered federally recognized tribes. It also includes a list of key participants, play at the time of the passage of ANCSA, that Ron Inouye and I compiled to help students keep track of some of the names of those active at the time of the passage of ANCSA, including the Alaska Native leaders, as well as the government officials that were involved then. And then the bulk of the work is the description of collections by location and detailed inventory of the collections that was compiled and edited by Karen Brewster based on a team of researchers that were hired under this grant and worked in a very compressed period of time, and also during the middle of COVID. So that was a daunting experience for all of us. Next slide, please. So as Will indicated, this was brainstormed, I guess, at a coffee house in Fairbanks. And since actually the summer of 2020, the ANCSA at 50 committee began meeting, and we had bi-weekly meetings for almost 2 years. It was a combination of paid labor and volunteers. And as I indicated earlier, there were problems getting into archives because of COVID. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about the bibliography. But the archives that were visited were very gracious in getting the researchers in, even though there were a lot of restrictions about being closed to the public and so on and so forth. And there were staffing considerations as well. So a lot of it had to be by appointment. The funding was thanks to the Rasmussen Foundation and Atwood Foundation grant to the UAA APU Consortium Library. And then we had contributions from Doyon Limited, Sea Alaska, Bering Straits, Chalista, and Koniag Native corporations. Next slide, please. The types of collections were there were the academic collections at the two at the two large university libraries in the state, Anchorage and Fairbanks, the Atwood Resource Center of the Anchorage Museum, the Ted Stevens Foundation, which had a large collection from the files of the late Ted Stevens. And actually, at the very end of this project, the ANCSA-related items in the Ted Stevens Foundation were transferred to the UAA Consortium Library and are now accessible there, which is great since the Ted Stevens archives are still not open to the public. So that was a great step forward. AFN resources, National Park Service resources, and the official archives, the Alaska State Archives. Bruce Parham did a meticulous job of searching out materials in the National Archives and the three presidential foundations, Nixon, Carter, and Ford, that had to do with ANCSA and ANILCA. And he also compiled a list of some of the repositories outside of Alaska. We did not have the money to travel and do original research in those archives. But as a result of online searches, there's an indication of a very good record from Bruce Parham for the National Archives, and then for the repositories outside of Alaska, also for the Native corporations. There are suggestions of what might be fertile field for future researchers, the things that we identified but couldn't actually inventory as we did the in-state archives. Next slide, please. So this is the cover of the final version of the guide. As I said, it's in 3 volumes, and the bulk of it is the history and archival collections. The bibliography we will get to, and as I said, we'll recommend the resource for teaching, ANCSA, and that currently is up, I believe, on the Alaska, featured on the Alaska Historical Society website. So it's easy to find there. I've also put the links to the guides in the chat, and both the Scholar Works, where it actually resides, the Alaska Historical Society, the sponsoring website. So those are in the chat if you want to take a look. And next slide, please. Before we get into the contents, I think it's because of the size of the collection descriptions, it is worthwhile to point out navigation aids. This is the librarian speaking here. So to help researchers and students, the guide is not something you're likely to sit down and read cover to cover unless you're a true insomniac, but the collection descriptions are full of rich materials, but because they are so massive, that there are some special navigation aids. The first one is that all of the sections of the table of contents, each line is linked. So if you click on any of the lines in the table of contents, it will take you directly to that particular section of the Volume 1 guide. And then next slide, please. The other navigation aids are found at the top and bottom of each page. In Volume 1, at the top of the page, what looks like a header is actually similar to the breadcrumbs, or is the equivalent of breadcrumbs that you might recognize on a website. But because this has the look of a print document, it might not be obvious that if you click on any of the locations at the top, Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, other, it will take you to the collections that are in from that area. And then it also can take you to particular collections. It can take you to the top of the Fairbanks, Alaska, and Polar Regions collection if you're somewhere deep within it. And in this case, this citation is for the Alfred Ketzler Sr. ANCSA collection, and we'll show that in more detail in a second. But if you look at the bottom pages in all 3 volumes, you can navigate from one volume to another. If you're in volume 1, you can click to go to volume 2 or 3. If you're in any of the others, the same thing holds true. In volume 1, you can also go to the other subsections of volume 1, the introduction, the timeline, key participants, as it shows at the bottom of this page. Next slide, please. So, in addition, there is the standard convention of doing a keyword search of the document by doing Control F and typing in a term or a name, and it will give you, it will lead you to all instances of that term. Finally, there's most of the photographs are linked to the digital sources by clicking on the photos themselves. We had lots of photos that we wanted to show. We finally, in the end, had to limit the number of photos, but there's some very interesting and significant photos that are in the final product. And if you click on them, in most cases, it will take you to the original digital source. So next slide, those are the navigation tools. What you actually find if you are using volume 1, for example, and these examples are a little bit interior centric because as it happens, Will, Karen, and I are all located in Fairbanks, so excuses for that. But this is a sample of what you would find for any particular collection. You would find under the location the name of the archive, and then under that archive there would be listing for all their collections. If we clicked on the one for the Alfred Ketzler Sr. collection, we would see something like this, a brief description of who Al Ketzler was and his importance in the Native Claims Settlement Act and land claims. And then it tells the kind of scope of the collection at this particular institution. And then at the bottom, because there are catalog links to specific parts of the collection, you have the URL there as well. Next slide, please. And so if we're in the collection and we go to box 4, the guide will tell us in folder 10, there's a document, Chiefs Conference, Tanana, Alaska, June 24th, 26th, 1962. And in this is a document that's a report from this early conference of reconvening of the Tanana chiefs actually in Tanana. And some of the concerns that are expressed are that the state is taking over our land to, this is a quote, to understand the new laws and to learn to make money to buy food, we must make sure that our children have an education. Another statement under the heading land is, our people always thought they owned the land where they lived and hunted. They did not lose it by war and they did not sell it. We still feel it is ours. So this was the beginning of some of the galvanizing moments in the lead up to ANCSA. Now I have to note that this document itself, the head of Chiefs Conference, is not in the guide. It is in the folder 10 of box 4. But this is an example of what you find if you visit the collection, and our guide will help you locate those. Next slide, please. And then another collection at the same location is the Bear Ketzler, Alfred Ketzler Jr., the son of Al, has a photographic collection. And here is one of the photos of the very meeting that we were seeing the report of in the previous slide. So the connections between the different collections are easy to make if you browse through the guide. Next slide, please. And then, Will, did you want to talk about the importance of some of the, this is from a different collection, the Gruning collection at UAF, and would you like to talk about the importance of these two documents?
Yeah, I think so. I'm having a little bit of trouble reading it. This is the Tionic one, right?
Right, it's the announcement, the press release from the Department of the Interior.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Tionic played a very, very important role in the history of land claims, in that when they had their reservation, they were able to lease the oil and gas resources on the reservation, which provided a big chunk of money, and they invested some of that into their village, but they used a significant part of it to help other Native groups around the state. And one of the things that they did was they invested in the first statewide meeting of Alaska Natives in Anchorage. And I think that, yes, that's what the letter is on the right-hand side of the screen from Emil Nadi, which is a description of the meeting itself. And this is really a very, very important document. And I was just thrilled. I mean, it made my socks go up and down when I saw this, because I knew how significant it was in terms of the formation of the Alaska Federation of Natives. And so this is one we're going to feature in our special issue. Next slide, please. And here is that article that I mentioned in the session this morning about Willie Hensley writing an article using the Western legal terms to explain Native rights under Western law. And this is a primary document coming from a Native leader using Western legal terms to explain to his people what rights they have. And this document appears in many, many of the collections, and is just a priceless piece of work. Next slide, please.
And I'd like to add that actually it was a class assignment. I think Will said an article, but it was written as a class assignment in Jay Rabinowitz's class. So all the more notable because it was a student effort when he was quite young.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
You got it. You got it.
Oh, I do it. I'm sorry. This slide is particularly important because this is the letter that William Paul wrote for Charlie Edwardson Jr. that I mentioned earlier. And this was the claim to all of the North Slope by the Native community. So this was the first huge land claim statement, and in legal terms, by a legal lawyer, a legal Tlingit lawyer, William Paul.
And it's notable that it was found in the Frederick Paul collection, who was the son of William Paul, and it was the last letter in the folder, but it was this very seminal letter from his father, acting on behalf of the North Slope residents.
Yes, thank you. And that's at the UAA APU Consortium Library Archives. So that's another archival source.
Cody, next. Yeah.
Go ahead. Sue, did you want to add more?
No, I can, the Tundra Times newspaper archive from the Tussey Consortium Library in Upyavik is a wonderful resource that's been around for several decades. So I'm thinking this audience is familiar with it, but for students of ANCSA, it is a wealth of resources, and this is probably the most famous headline in connection with ANCSA right here that's being shown. And I can't read the newspaper article that Karen chose as the other example, but there were in the archives lots of newspaper clippings that are not necessarily cataloged in any way except through this resource. So next slide, please. Our bibliography could not do an exhaustive list of newspaper articles on ANCSA. So these photographs are interesting. And Will, do you have something to say about Richard Frank here?
Richard Frank was a native leader from the village of Minto and was a bit of a historian himself. He documented Minto's fight for land claims going back to the 1930s. And that's available in an oral recording we have. And more on that later. Don Wright on the right side of the screen was president of the Alaska Federation of Natives at the time of land claims and was a supporter of the corporate solution to land claims.
Next slide. And here are more from the archives of the Tundra Times.
Laura Burke was a big supporter of the native land claims. And then on the right, Jules Wright, who just recently passed away, and Ralph Perdue from Fairbanks were prominent in the Fairbanks community and the local organization of land claims movement.
Next slide, please.
A protest slide by natives for land claims on the left. Charlie Edwardson speaking to a group of people at the AFN convention on the right, and then a series of native leaders taken in Washington, D.C. on the steps maybe of the Capitol.
That's the next
Next
slide.
slide, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Alice Brown, the woman seated in the far right on the bottom, she has a wonderful collection of archival documents at the UAA APU Library Archives dealing with land claims. And Sue, tell your story about Alice.
Okay, real quick. Rebecca Lyon, Alice's granddaughter or daughter, was my neighbor when I lived in Anchorage across the alley. And one day we were both dumping our garbage in the alley at the same time. and taking out our trash cans. And Rebecca said, "Oh, you know, you're a librarian. I have a relative who had so many papers. And I've inherited them, and I have boxes and boxes of them. I don't know what to do. I thought I would take them to the Alaska Native Heritage Center, but at that time they didn't have an archivist to handle them, so they had to say no." And she said, "What do you suggest?" And I said, there are a number of places. And I told her about the state library, and I told her about the UAA APU Consortium Library. And she said, "Well, thank you. I'll investigate those." And then I moved away, and I didn't didn't happen to run into her, and didn't find out what had ever happened. And we were working on this project, and all of a sudden and I wasn't told this relative's name. All of a sudden we were looking at the Alice Brown project, and the UAA archive records said that they were donated by her niece, granddaughter, whoever, Rebecca Lyon. And I just had the thrill of thinking, well, she followed through, and she got them into good hands, the papers into good hands. And I always like to tell that story because I hope it will inspire other people who are looking at collections in their own in their attics or basements, or they inherit them, to try to do something that will open those collections, those private collections, up to researchers too. So next slide. We're going to have to work quickly here. There are all kinds of video clips. We can't show you any of them, but these are among the ones that Karen picked out. And I would highly recommend both Rosita Worrell's ANCSA, A Path to Assimilation or Cultural Survival. And you can find that both in the guide and the bibliography, with a link to the actual speech. And Bobby Kilberg's speech, she was a staffer for President Nixon, and she appears briefly in a 50th anniversary film by the Ted Stevens Foundation. And it's just like being behind the scenes in the White House, a you were there moment on the dynamics within the White House on the passage of ANCSA. So I highly recommend that. So next slide, please. And then there are lots of audio recordings. Notable among the audio recordings, both in this volume and in the bibliography, are the recordings of the Alaska Native Review Commission, Thomas Berger, the Canadian jurist, hired by the International Circumpolar Conference to measure the impacts of ANCSA in 1983, 84. And he traveled all over Alaska, you may remember, and took testimony from Alaska Native people who were affected directly by ANCSA and what it meant to them. And the testimonies are powerful, and there are lots of them, and those are collected in the Oral History Collection in Rasmussen. There are transcripts there, and also at the Alaska State Library. And next slide, please. And there are audio recordings, and LitSite Alaska, there at UAA, has a 30th anniversary oral history project from ANCSA that's very rich. There are 24 interviews with people who were leaders and original participants in ANCSA. And then our own project, Jukebox, at Rasmussen Library, the brainchild of Dr. Schneider and Karen Brewster's work. This interview with Richard Frank tells from his point of view about the land claims issues and the fight, and especially the interesting galvanizing situation that happened in Minto. And next slide, please. We're going to have to go really quickly through the bibliography. I apologize. We were hampered. Joe and I You're not able to visit the libraries really much in person during most of this. So most of our research was online and through the miracle of interlibrary loan. Next slide, please. Kind of an interesting way to do a bibliography. And we have, of course, books. It's a bibliography, and these are popular titles. The books are primarily a lot of autobiography, a lot of memoirs, documentation of early Alaska Native political activity from Tanana chiefs that Will Schneider edited, and the Firecracker Boys, I'm sure you all recognize. Then Fight for It by Fred Paul, and the two books that are featured in the pictures here by Donald Craig Mitchell. You heard a lot about him. He documents very closely what led up to Alaska Native claims settlement, and also the process of the passage itself from a kind of insider view, but with a very definite point of view. Judy Ferguson's Oral Histories, Windows to the Land, that focuses on leaders in the ANCSA movement, and of course Thomas Berger's Village Journey, which documents his journey through Alaska to take testimony on the impacts. Next slide, please. Most scholarly works are in the, and Willie Hensley is everywhere. He's in all sections of he's virtually all sections of the bibliography. If I go to the next slide now, the articles, in the article section, you'll find more scholarly works. Anyway.
We need the next slide. Next slide, please.
Here we go. Well, something happened. Okay, audio productions. Well, this Holding Our Ground is an absolutely excellent 15-part radio series that was based on the testimonial of Alaska Native villagers when they were testifying to Thomas Berger. And there's an interview with Thomas Berger himself. Really great sound quality, highly recommend it. And then we, of course, have some of our Project Jukebox audios and transcripts that are relevant to ANCSA, and more about that as we end. But next slide, please. Yeah, there are the articles, and a lot of them are scholarly, although there are some popular articles like the 30-volume series the 30-article series in Indian Country Today by Megan Sullivan, which touches on many of the issues that were of subsistence and sovereignty that arose before, after, and during ANCSA and have not been resolved, such as sovereignty and the subsistence questions. And this one by Aaron Shute is covers the provision 7I, which is the revenue sharing provision of ANCSA. Next slide, please. And finally, there are films. This is one by Jacob Adams, a North Slope leader. And I will ask you to move on to the next slide now, Cody. And finally, how do you find it? I put the URLs in the chat, and but also if you don't have them handy, if you go to any library that's a part of the Alaska catalog, which would be all your major academic and public libraries covering 89% of the population, and type in ANCSA, in this case, the bibliography. Next slide, please. You don't have to do a sophisticated search. You'll get a citation. You'll see online access. I circled in red. You click on that, and that will take you directly to the work resident on Scholar Works. So that's another avenue to get it if you don't have the URL bookmarked or you don't have it handy. And next slide, please. And it looks like this. It has the Scholar Works beginning, and then next slide. Here again are the URLs, and the last slide is a advertisement for the newest Jukebox project, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act Jukebox, featuring a number of people that are listed here and made possible by the grant from the state library that Karen Brewster recently finished. So, done. We have time for one question, huh?
Yes, there's just a few minutes, but I have something to say. That this has spawned a couple more projects, and Will referenced it, that he is now working on a guide to documents that's going to be published as a special issue of Alaska History. He's going to pick out some of these gems that we found in the course of looking at the archives and the sources and providing brief annotations. And I think they'll probably talk more about that in the next session when they talk about teaching resources. The other thing that's already happened is we've had a few more contributions that should be included in the bibliography. Our bibliography was built on bibliographies that were done by groups at ANCSCA at 30 and ANCSCA at 40. And Sue and I used to talk about the next one will be ANCSCA at 60, but we're also already talking about a way that we can sort of keep a running list of editions that perhaps will be available on the Alaska Historical Society webpage. In the questions, I see that Ira Perman has asked about recording this session so that it can be used. And yes, Cody with the Anchorage Museum is recording them all. And then afterwards, we plan to get them on a format, as we have done with our last two virtual AHS conferences, so that you can access the particular presentations through the AHS website. Have I left a minute or two for others in the audience to ask questions?
While we're looking, I will say I answered Ira incorrectly because I thought he was talking about permission to use the documents, the guides themselves, and they are under Creative Commons, so that gives you wide latitude to use the actual online versions.
And Cody, who's the technical person for this, told me yesterday that once a session is done, that it's almost instantaneous that it will be available as an archival record. So it's very quick.
We need to give a real big shout out to Steve Rollins who's the director of the UAA APU Consortium Library, for his incredible support for this project and encouragement. Putting it on ScholarWorks just is, I think, a really great accomplishment, so that it will continue to be on a monitored, stable platform. Sue, do you want to talk at all about how you've worried about the links and keeping them?
I'm going to jump in with that, Joe. Thank you. When we looked at Joe's and my work was based on bibliography ANCSA at 40, and when we looked at it 10 years later, most of the links that they had included in the previous work were broken, and we actually tracked down most of them, but we had to revise them. And so this form of publication is actually perfect for a document that has so many online, has so many URLs contained in the body of it, because I think the plan is that periodically we'll go through and we'll check all the links again. They were last checked in May, and they were good except for one with a typo in it, but we will be looking periodically to keep them refreshed and up to date. And as Joe said, we also can easily add the new things that are coming out all the time. There's still 50th anniversary publications coming out and coming to our attention. And also we hope that this will inspire you to dig deep and to take on some ANCSA projects, use this guide as it was intended. And there'll be more publications from people in this audience and from the Historical Society that we can add as we update the guide.
And hopefully people will use it and prepare presentations for subsequent AHS conferences and conference sessions. So thank you, Will and Sue. And I hope that everybody's enjoyed the introduction to what I found was a really exciting project, and I learned so much from the real documents, the real stuff, good stuff. And as I said, the big contribution is adding all of the media, the audio and the oral histories. Sue didn't dwell on a section of it, though, too, that looks at the student papers, theses, and dissertations that have already been written about ANCSA. But it was such a pivotal, important act that is it safe to say it changed the course of Alaska history? So, okay, we'll sign off now. Again, we'll have a really good discussion coming up here about teaching ANCSA, volume 3 of our guide that will start at 4 o'clock. 4 or, yeah, 4.
Yes, 4.
4, so you have an hour.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.